Good morning. This is Pastor Stuart Waterhouse with 10 Minutes After Midnight, episode 4 on human sacrifice. In today's episode, we will explore the transformation of the Hawaiian religion into that of Christianity. If you haven't seen the previous 3 episodes, please go back and watch them now, as it is important context to understand as we go forward. In the next episode, we will examine the human sacrifice of Jesus himself. And all of this is just giving us context so that we can understand what we as Christians believe by understanding the prior religions, in this case, the religion of Hawaii. Hawaii religion is important because it dates back to antiquity and basically untouched by the changes around the world as the Hawaiian Islands were isolated. And so it does give us a deep understanding. And in today's episode, we'll start with the Hawaiian prophet Keki Opilo. Keki Opilo took an o'o bird, that's a black colored bird with a long feathered tail, used for a sacrifice. He put his mouth over the mouth of the bird and sucked its breath out and then broke its neck, thus the sacrifice, and he could prophesy. And in his prophecy, he said, "Foreigners shall possess the land." The idea of foreigners, yes, Hawaiians were somewhat familiar with foreigners. We're talking about pre-contact, but still they never really saw foreigners. So it's kind of a new and odd prophecy which stirred the kahunas across all the islands as to what does this mean. Well, what we need to do is examine the rivalry of the chiefs. Kahekili was the moi of Maui, and Chief Kahana was the moi of Oahu. Well, Chief Kahana was raised in Kahekili's court. Kahekili really had the vision of uniting one grand kingdom extending upon all Hawaiian islands. Kamehameha fulfilled that vision, but Kahekili was just prior to Kamehameha, and he had pretty much already accomplished that before Kamehameha came along. Most of it through intrigue, but through warfare as well. Kahekili was probably the most fierce chief that ever lived. He was tattooed across half of his body, straight down, splitting his body in half with the tattoo. Very fierce looking. But Chief Kahana from Oahu was taken in and adopted as a young boy by Kahekili to grow up in Kahekili's court. Then as he got older, the chief on Oahu was actually overturned by a council of chiefs that met because, well, they just didn't think he was a good chief. And then they needed a new chief to replace him, so they sent for Kahahana, which was in Kahekili's court on Maui, because Kahahana is really from Oahu, and they made him chief. And so then Oahu had a new moi. Now, Kahekili then sent word to Chief Kahahana on Oahu and said, "As a token of your gratitude for me raising you as my own son, can you please gift me with Kualoa?" Kualoa was an area we know today is part of Kaneohe. Basically, there's a ranch there, beautiful view of the mountain cliffs and the ocean. But Kualoa was a very sacred area, and Kahahana didn't know what to do. So he convened a council of chiefs to ask their advice. And of course, no chief would speak up and give advice because they knew Kahekili was very fierce and would take vengeance on anybody that might oppose the request. So they all remained silent. And Kahahana didn't know what to do then. So the Kahuna Nui of Oahu, which would be the ranking kahuna on Oahu, he was at Pu'omahuka he came to the council to speak up. And the kahuna's name was Kau Pulu Pulu, or Kau Pulu Pulu. I'm not sure which way to pronounce it. But Kau Pulu Pulu said, "Oh, great Chief Kahana, Kualoa contains Pohukaina Cave, which is the burial grounds for every chief for 1,000 years. It is the heart of Oahu. It's the most sacred area. and basically it's symbolic of the whole island. If you give up Kualoa, basically you're giving up the whole island um, to Chief Kahekili. So he said, "Oh, great chief, you can't do that. You have to tell Kahekili no." So with that advice, then Kahana had the courage to tell Kahekili sorry, he can't grant him Kualoa. And then what Kahekili did, he was very treacherous. He then took Chief Kahana in private and he said, "You know, your kahuna told you not to give up Kualoa to me because your kahuna came to me in private." Now Kahekili's lying, of course. Came to me in private and offered me Kualoa himself. So Chief Kahana didn't know what to do now, you know. He was just lied to, that saying he was double crossed by his kahuna. Well, so he sent for his kahuna to meet him in Waikiki, which is where Chief Kahana had his residence, and to question him. But he didn't really intend to meet him because there was no way he was going to actually question him about it. I suppose in his heart he probably knew the truth, but he also knew how fierce his stepfather Kahekili was, and didn't dare oppose him. So he had his chief warriors stage an ambush in Waianae. So as the kahuna Kaupulupulu came around Kaina Point and then through Waianae, making his way to Waikiki Beach, he reached Pu'ukahea. At that time, it wasn't called Pu'ukahea. I'm not sure what the name of the heiau there was, but because of this incident, it became renamed Pu'ukahea. And there he was ambushed, and he was captured along with his son that was traveling with him, his son also a kahuna. And they were taken to the heiau where they were detained. And then the soldiers started taunting the kahuna's son, poking a spear at his eyes. And there's a lot there because, as you learned in previous videos, the eye was removed with a spear and then eaten by the second ranking kahuna in order to gain the vision of the sacrificial victim. So in this case, they were poking it to spear at the kahuna's son, also kahuna, and that son was the second ranking. So that son would have used the spear in ceremonial devouring of the eyeball to gain vision. And so they were mocking him by repeating the same thing, making him the victim, right? And then his father called out to him and he said, "Flee to the sea, for from the sea shall come the life of the land." And so his son fled to the sea, and the soldiers threw a spear, piercing his back, and he bled out and died in the ocean, thus becoming a human sacrifice, ordaining the words of his father, saying that from the sea shall come the life of the land. And then the soldiers took the kahuna to Waikiki, captured, tied up, and he was then sacrificed and hung from a coconut tree till his body just deteriorated. And that was the end of him. Now, when these things happen, they don't happen very often. It's the highest disrespect for religion by a chief, because it overturns religion, it overturns the political society, it destroys everything. I mean, it only happened like 3 times in Hawaiian history. The first time was when the first Kahuna Nui, Pa'ao, came to the Big Island, and a chief had committed sacrilege by killing somebody in a heiau. And so all the chiefs came to Pa'ao and asked for his intervention. Well, long story short, he did intervene, and his religion then became spread throughout the islands. It was an overturn of the religion that was there prior, the worship of Kani, and now it's the worship of Ku. And so again, the religion would be overturned by this prophecy of the kahuna that was betrayed at Pu'ukahea. Pu'ukahea means hill of calling, because that's where he called out to his son. And this is a very important pivotal point. okay? And so after that, then all the kahunas were on the lookout. What religion would come from the sea? Or what foreigners would bring it and possess the land? Kaikili used this as a pretext to invade Oahu, saying that Kahana had disrespected his kahuna, which he did, but it was done at Kaikili's orchestration secretly, but the world didn't know, right? Or the kingdom, the islands, the people, and the kahunas and the lower chiefs, they didn't know that Kaikili had set Kahana up. But Kaikili used it as a pretext. He invaded Oahu and pretty much conquered Oahu. He took the kahuna's brother, made him the chief kahuna at Pu'o which is in Pupukea, up high overlooking the bay, Waimea Bay. And then that kahuna's son was named Koi. And then Koi became the new warrior kahuna at Pu'o And a ship came in to Waimea Bay, and the ships weren't seen very often. But Koi saw this ship from the distance because he had a good view overlooking the bay. And the ship was looking for provisions. They needed to fill the barrels with water. So the captain of the ship and the ship's astronomer named Gooch. Gooch was very religious, by the way. They went inland and walked up the river talking while their shipmates, of course, did the work of loading barrels of fresh water back into the ship. Well, when they got up, and of course Koi was watching this because he wanted to know, what were these people? Were they emissaries from God? And they did some kind of sacrilege, these two people. Not sure what it was, but that was the excuse for Koi to intervene. And so Koi's warriors, because he was a kahuna warrior, surrounded Gooch and the ship's captain. One of them threw a rock and it hit one of the two white people, and they cried out. And then, of course, the warriors said, well, these can't be gods because gods wouldn't cry. So they fell upon him and captured him. Now, they knew Lua. Lua is a form of martial art where you disjoint every joint in the body. You pull the arms loose in the shoulder joints, the legs, the knees, the elbows. And so both of these people were taken back up to the heiau to be living sacrifices, not killed, because Koi wanted to see what he could learn from them, and so once they were in the heiau, you couldn't kill them because that would be sacrilege. So they were just left on the altar alive, and as the kahunas came in every day to examine them, William Gooch would have been praying to Jesus. And so Koi learned that this new God would be Jesus. Very fascinating. And that would be secret knowledge of the kahunas. Now, at the same time, let's back up a little bit. Let's back up a few years because the story starts again on the Big Island. And in Punalu'u, which is a very beautiful black sand beach, the turtles come up and sun themselves on the black sand. It's kind of a bay that's protected from the waves. And there's a pond with coconut trees, very gorgeous. And so the chief of Ka'u had his residence there. That was his personal village. And they were attacked. Now, these villages would have a cave for refuge purposes. They're known as a refuge cave. I've been in many of them. You go in the cave, you can see where water drips from the ceiling, and on the floor right under the drip would be an old PE shell to capture the dripping water so they could take it and get a drink, and prolong themselves in the cave. Some of these refugee caves came out in a cliff overlooking the ocean where they could actually drop a line and fish and get something to eat while they were in the cave without having to come out. And of course, the entrance of the cave would be camouflaged and disguised so the attackers wouldn't know where it was. And so the chief took his family and went in the cave to hide. Now, I should back up a little bit because this is about the chief's son. And the son's name is Opukahaia. Opukahaia. You see, when he was born, the chief's wife, the chiefess, had died, and she lay dead. And they took a sharp rock and they cut her stomach open because the baby was moving, and the baby was saved. And so they named the baby Opukahaia, which means they had extracted him from the womb, had cut it open. And so now, of course, it would be his stepmother that would be his new mom with the chief. And they were in the cave hiding. He was 12 years old now, okay? And after 3 days, they decided to come out of the caves thinking that the warriors would have left. But it was a mistake. The warriors hadn't left. And the warriors saw him and killed the stepmother and killed his chief, his father, in front of him. And he took his baby brother and tried to run. He was only 12 years old now, but the warriors threw a spear. The spear pierced through his baby brother, killing the baby. But it saved him because the baby absorbed the spear impact. And so he was captured. And then when he was captured, eventually his uncle recognized the little boy and negotiated his release into the uncle's care from his captors. And the uncle was a kahuna. I'm not sure what ranking, probably not the highest, but nonetheless an important kahuna at, what we know today, the City of Refuge in Captain Cook. That was the center of religion for all of Hawaii. Of the worship of Ku for all of Hawaii. And that's where Captain Cook had landed his ship, Kealakekua Bay there, and gone up to the Heiau. And when Captain Cook had landed, the kahuna in charge there was Hewa Hewa. Not Kahuna Nui Hewa Hewa, but Hewa Hewa's grandfather. And he was the ranking kahuna when Captain Cook landed. And of course, they viewed Captain Cook as an emissary from the gods. And, so they threw a big feast for Captain Cook. You wouldn't want to make a god or his emissary have to do any work. So at the feast, they would have somebody assigned to chew the food for Captain Cook, because make God work and chew his own food just would be sacrilege. And of course, I have to give it to Captain Cook. He ate the food that was pre-chewed for him. Well, of course, what else was he going to do? But he'd have to do it without making any face of disgust. He had to be smiling. Just put yourselves in Captain Cook's shoes. I mean, it must have been fantastic, right? Exploring unknown islands and unknown cultures and so forth. But as you know, the kahunas would pick a grandchild to be his replacement kahuna. So Hewa Hewa picked his grandchild, Hewa Hewa, which later became Kahuna Nui. Hewa Hewa, I think the greatest kahuna next to Pao himself. And he became kahuna of all the Hawaiian Islands, okay? He was then a kahuna under King Kamehameha. When Kamehameha conquered all the islands, Hewa Hewa was his personal kahuna. Kamehameha had started out with a different kahuna, but that kahuna died or went away or something happened, and then Hewa Hewa replaced him and became chief kahuna. So meanwhile, back at the City of Refuge, the center of the Hawaiian religion, this boy, Opukahaia, his uncle had brought him to the City of Refuge to train to be a kahuna. Now, because he was a li'i, he could never be the ranking kahuna. That just didn't happen. The ranking kahuna would have to be a descendant of Pa'ao. But the second position was usually an honorary kahuna from the ali'i. And that was the person that would smear his body with the red mud, naked. And he would take part in the ceremony naked, smeared with the red clay. And he's the one that would take the spear and the sacrifice, pull out the left eyeball and consume it before the audience. That was very theatrical, quite a show. But by doing that, he would gain the vision. So Opukahaia was being trained to fill the second position. He would have become a very the second high-ranking kahuna for all of the islands eventually, had he stayed in that position. Um, I don't know how many sacrifices he would have participated in, but probably quite a few. I mean, this was the center of the religion, and his participation wouldn't have been killing the victim. That would have been the ranking kahuna. But his participation very much would have been to devour the eyeball of every sacrifice. And which he started at the age of, well, 12 or 13 in training to become. I don't know how old he was when the ship came in again, but a ship landed, and basically he wanted to go to where the ship came from. When it would return, he wanted to be on board that ship and learn about this Jesus and this prophecy that foreigners would possess the land, and that from the sea the new religion would come. And so he convinced the ship captain to give him passage. He got the blessing of the Kahuna Nui Hewa Hewa, the grandfather Hewa Hewa, and he went on the ship and ended up in America. And from America, he ended up in the New England states. And from there, he learned English while on the ship on the way to New England. And when he got there, he was taken in by a professor at Bible college. And there he learned Hebrew and to read the Bible in its ancient language of Hebrew. So he learned English, he learned Hebrew, all this in a very short period. As I said, the kahunas were really, and the Ali'is were of a superior race. They had the mental acuity that we can only dream of. He, in fact, started to translate the Bible from Hebrew into Hawaiian. And he was then the first Christian learning of Jesus at the Bible college while he stayed in the home of the college's professor. He did get sick because he didn't have the resistance to pneumonia, and he passed away and died. But before he passed away, it was his desire that Hawaiian people would learn about this Jesus that he had found and come to know and love. And basically, he gave the missionary call, and it was heeded. And that call brought the first missionaries to Hawaii because of this Hawaiian boy kahuna, now young man kahuna, now a Christian. And I'm sure he prayed for his teachers, those he knew, which would have been the grandfather Hewa Hewa, and the grandfather's son Hewa Hewa, which was also his teacher. And he was associated with both. God honored that prayer. And so what ended up happening now, King Kamehameha had captured and established the kingdom. He was the first great king over all of the islands. And when he died, he actually went to his personal heiau in Kona, Ahu'ina Heiau. And the heiau still exists. You can go there and see it because it's been somewhat restored. You can see the grass huts on the heiau and so forth. There was a healing rock in there, and King Kamehameha laid on the healing rock hoping to get healed. It didn't work. And then, of course, he died, and he stayed in that heiau, his bones did, until he was deified. And then in the middle of the night, he was secreted out to be buried. And yes, I know the cave he's buried in, but I'm not going to disclose that here. Anyway, before he died, or around that time, Kahuna Nui Hewa Hewa, which was King Kamehameha's kahuna, so he was the most powerful kahuna now of the United Kingdom of all the islands, would have personally sacrificed maybe 2,000 people, maybe much more. So Kahuna Nui Hewa Hewa had a vision that the missionaries were coming. Now, the boats had come prior, but these were sailors. Most of the sailors weren't all that religious. As we know, Gooch was, and he ended up being sacrificed in Waimea. But some of them were whaling vessels, but not too many ships, just very, very few. But enough that they now knew there were foreigners and that there were ships and it existed. maybe one ship every year or something, not very many, but he had a vision. And so when King Kamehameha died, Heva Heva abolished the Hawaiian religion. That's a huge step. But of course, he knew this was in line with the prophecy of the kahuna whose son was murdered and therefore become a sacrifice of the father's prophecy. And the prophecies are proactive, they make reality. It's not just a prediction of the future, but it creates reality. So he was aware of that. And he knew these missionaries were going to come because God gave it to give him a vision. So in his vision, he knew where the first missionary ship would land, which was up in the northern part of Hawaii, somewhere near Kauai High. And so he went up there and waited. He waited on the beach for 6 months, trusting his vision. And sure enough, a ship appeared on the horizon and came right to that spot, to that very beach where he was at. And they began to get off of the ship onto a lifeboat to come on shore. He got onto his canoe and went out to meet the ship and spoke with them. And he said, "Don't come on shore here, but let me accompany you, and I will take you to meet the chief," which is a lot better than meeting the local village. In this case, not just the chief, but the king of all of Hawaii, who happened to be at this time at Ahu'ena Heiau in Kona, where King Kamehameha had died. So this would have been King Kamehameha's son, is now king. And when the religion was abolished, of course, Kahuna Nui Heva Heva had the king's son and the co-regent, the king's wife, make the announcement, because he wouldn't have had the authority to abolish the worship of Kani, only the worship of Ku. But by this time, the worship of Ku had pretty much conquered or homogenized, assimilated the worship of Kani. So he was able to have all the heiaus across all of the islands cease. It was abolished, but it was done through royal decree, right? And so now, 6 months later, he meets the missionary, goes on board the ship, and he takes him to Ahu'ena. And so it's right there at Ahu'ena where the first Bible in a box was taken ashore. And that's where the Bible first made to land in Hawaii, right there in Kona. And of course, the king accepted missionaries. And then Kahuna Nui Heva Heva donated land, which was on Oahu, not the Big Island, at Waipio Valley, in the valley at Waimea Valley, and to build the first church. And so the first Protestant church was built there. Later that was moved to Haleiwa. And can you imagine the greatest mind in all of Hawaii, the sitting ranking kahuna, who himself had performed thousands of sacrifices, now sitting on a church pew, listening to the Protestant pastor preach his Sunday message every week. It's an awesome thought. It's just hard to comprehend. And literally, the Hawaiian religion was abolished and Christianity was accepted. Now, the early Hawaiians called the first Christian churches heiaus, of course, because it was the place of worship, right? It's where they met with God. They called them Luakini heiaus. Luakini was the sacrificial heiau. There were agriculture heiaus. There was navigation heiaus where they learned astronomy. There were healing heiaus. 5 different principal type of heiaus. But the ranking heiau was the Luakini, and that's where the human sacrifice took place. And that's what they called the early churches. Why? Because the minister was preaching the sacrifice of Jesus. So Kahuna Nui Heva Heva saw the sacrifice of Jesus as being a fulfillment of his own religion. You see, in his religion, there was a tension when you made a sacrifice. And that tension was you were sacrificing the wrongdoer, the kapu breaker, the person who committed Heva Heva. No play on the name with Sakuna's name, by the way. Heva Heva means sin or wrongdoing. And therefore you were punishing wrongdoing, which is upholding righteousness, and thus God blessed the the society that did this, the kahuna that did this, the land that did this, was under God's blessing because they're upholding righteousness by punishing wrongdoing. Okay? At the same time, when you present a sacrifice to God, you can't give God the second best, can you? You have to give him the best, yes? So there was a tension in the sacrificial system, because if you're giving God a wrongdoer, it's not the perfect sacrifice, because he is a wrongdoer. So he's not perfect. His imperfection. So you had this tension in the religion, trying to give God the perfect sacrifice, and yet it always had an imperfection, because that was what was required to sacrifice the person. That he had to be a sinner, right? A lawbreaker. But in Jesus, this was resolved, because Jesus was sinless, without sin, yet he died because of sin. He died bearing sin, right? So Jesus was the sacrifice that solved that tension in the Hawaiian religion. He solved that tension in all sacrificial religions, but we'll get into that in our next video. This is Stuart Waterhouse with 10 Minutes After Midnight. Thank you. Goodbye.